Madam President, last fall, Republicans promised that if we were elected to the majority, that we would get Washington working again. And that wasn't a campaign slogan. That was a commitment. After 6 months of Republican control, I'm proud to report that we're delivering on that promise. The past 6 months in the Senate have been a most productive months in a long time. We passed bipartisan legislation to approve the Keystone Pipeline. We passed a bipartisan bill to help prevent suicides among veterans. We passed the first significant bipartisan reform of Medicare in years, which will ensure that our seniors have access to physicians and that those physicians are judged by the quality rather than the quantity of the care that they provide. We passed bipartisan legislation to give law enforcement new tools to fight human trafficking and provide support for trafficking victims. We passed a bipartisan bill to authorize funding for our national defense and to provide for the needs of our men and women in uniform. And those are just some of the highlights. Madam President, every piece of legislation that I mentioned passed with bipartisan support. And one reason that happened is because the Republican majority has been committed to ensuring that all senators, whatever their party, have an opportunity to make their voices heard. Under Democrat leadership, not only were members of the minority party regularly shut out of the legislative process, but many rank-and-file Democrats were as well. During all of 2014, the Democrat leadership in the Senate allowed just 15 amendment roll call votes. 15 votes in an entire year. That's barely more than a vote a month. By contrast, the Republican-led Senate has taken more than 130 amendment roll call votes so far this year, or more than 21 votes a month. That's not only more amendment roll call votes than last year, it's more amendment roll call votes than the Senate has taken in the past 2 years combined. That's through the first 6 months of 2015. We got another 6 months to go, Madam President. Well, this week, the Senate's considering what I hope is going to be our next bipartisan achievement, and that's the legislation to help expand U.S. trade with other countries and increase the opportunities that are available for American businesses and American workers. Over the past few years, exports have been a bright spot in our economy, supporting an increasing number of American jobs each and every year. In 2014, exports supported 11.7 million U.S. jobs and made up 13% of our nation's economy. We need to continue to open markets around the globe to American goods and services. And the best way to do that is through new trade agreements. Countries with which we have free and fair trade agreements purchase substantially more from us than other countries. In fact, in 2013, free trade agreement countries purchased 12 times more goods per capita from the United States than non-free trade agreement countries. 12 times more goods per capita. For American workers, increased trade means more opportunity and increased access to high-paying jobs. Manufacturing jobs, Madam President, tied to exports pay on average 13 to 18% more than other jobs in our economy. Unfortunately, while trade agreements have proliferated around the globe over the past several years, the United States hasn't signed a new trade agreement in 8 years. A big reason for that is the fact that Trade Promotion Authority expired in 2007. Now, since 1934, almost all of the United States free trade agreements have been negotiated using Trade Promotion Authority or a similar streamlined, expedited process. Trade Promotion Authority is designed to put the United States in the strongest possible position when it comes to negotiating trade agreements. Under TPA, Congress sets guidelines for trade negotiations and outlines the priorities the administration must follow. In return, Congress promises a simple up or down vote on the resulting trade agreement instead of a long amendment process that could leave the final deal looking nothing like what was initially negotiated. That simple up or down vote is the key. It lets our negotiating partners know that Congress and trade negotiators are on the same page, which gives other countries the confidence they need to put their best offers on the table. And that, in turn, allows for a successful and timely conclusion of negotiations. Currently, the administration is negotiating 2 major trade agreements that have the potential to vastly expand the market for American goods and services in the European Union and in the Pacific. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is being negotiated with a number of Asia-Pacific nations, including Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. If this agreement is done right, it could have huge benefits for American agriculture, among other industries. Agricultural producers in my state of South Dakota and the presiding officer state of Iowa understand that Trade Promotion Authority is the most effective way to secure trade agreements that will benefit our farmers and our ranchers. One pork producer in my state of South Dakota contacted me to tell me that a successful TPP deal could increase U.S. pork exports to just one of the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries by literally hundreds of millions of dollars in a year. Madam President, discussions of the benefits of trade tend to focus on the economic benefits, and with good reason. It is something that helps our economy. It creates good-paying jobs, raises the standard of living for people in this country, and gives access for consumers to lower-cost goods and services. But new trade agreements also have the potential not just to result in economic gains for American farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers, but in national security gains for the country. When we make trade deals with other countries, we're not just opening new markets for our goods, we're also developing and cementing alliances. Trade agreements build bonds of friendship with other nations that extend not only to cooperation on economic issues, but to cooperation on security issues as well. It's also important to remember that just because the United States isn't negotiating trade agreements doesn't mean that other countries won't be. In fact, the United States hasn't signed a single new trade agreement over the past 8 years, but that hasn't prevented other countries from signing numerous trade agreements over the same period. If America fails to lead on trade, other nations like China will step in to fill the void. And these nations will not have the best interest of American workers and American families in mind. The bill before us today will help pave the way for the United States to cement alliances with friendly nations through trade, and will help ensure that any trade deals the United States enters into will be favorable to our economic and to our national security interests. The Senate passed a version of this bill last month with a bipartisan majority, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a similarly strong bipartisan vote yet this week. Madam President, Republicans believe that our nation's problems are best solved when members of both parties come together to find solutions for the American people. Republicans' plans for our second 6 months in the majority are the same as those for the first 6 months of our majority, and that is to make sure that we continue to move forward in a way that addresses the challenges that are facing our country. Unfortunately, last week we saw an unfortunate return to partisanship on the part of the Democrats when they blocked an appropriation bill to fund our troops. It's not that Democrats have a problem with this bill. In fact, many of them voted to support the funding this bill provides when they voted in favor of the National Defense Authorization Act last week. The Authorization Act is the first step in a two-step process which has to be followed by the appropriations bill that actually provides the funding. But Democrat leaders and the President, even though many of them supported the defense authorization bill, are upset that government agencies like the EPA and the IRS aren't receiving the Democrats' preferred level of funding, so they've decided to hold appropriations bills hostage in an effort to get what they want. Well, it's unfortunate that Democrats are holding funding for our troops hostage in order to get more funding for the EPA and the IRS. If Democrats believe funding levels on appropriation bills are not acceptable, they'll have the opportunity to offer amendments to increase the funding. But in order to do that, they have to allow us to actually proceed to consideration of these bills on the Senate floor. And what they are in effect doing now is filibustering any attempt to bring any spending bill up to the floor. Most recently, the one, as I mentioned, the funding bill for our troops. The bill that funds our national security interest in this country is currently being held hostage. Can't even get it on the floor. Can't even get it on the floor to debate it. We're not talking about ultimately passing it. We're talking about even having a discussion on the floor of the United States Senate about something as important as funding our troops and the important military objectives that we have as a nation. And yet right now we've got a filibuster that's being conducted by the Democrats, again, because they want to get more funding for their favorite agencies. Well, that's a bad way to go about this, and I'm hopeful that this obstruction, which is largely driven by the Democrat leadership, and that most rank-and-file Democrats will rethink a strategy that involves opposing every opportunity to fund our nation's priorities and to get things done for the American people. After years of stagnation in the Senate under Democrat leadership, I think even most Democrats have enjoyed governing in a functioning Senate again. We have dozens of bipartisan bills to show for the first 6 months of this year, and our record of accomplishment can continue if Democrats abandon their strategy of obstruction and continue to work with us to solve the challenges facing our country. And it can start by not objecting to proceeding, to even getting a bill that funds our national security interest here on the floor of the United States Senate so that we can debate it. And like I said, if they don't like the funding levels in there, we will have an open amendment process in which they can offer amendments to change those funding levels. But what they're doing right now is fundamentally wrong by not even allowing consideration of an appropriation bill that funds our military and pays our troops on the floor of the United States Senate. I hope that'll change. I hope the Democrats will join us to make the next 6 months of 2015 as productive as the first 6 months have been, and that we can point to bipartisan achievements that are good for the American people, that focus on their basic daily needs, that will promote policies that will grow our economy and create jobs and lead to a higher standard of living and higher increased take-home pay for people and for middle-income families across this country. Madam President, I yield the floor.